Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this session, the first session in the winter webinar series from Michigan Department of Ed on student acceleration. I am Dr. Meagan Walsh, and I'm an intensification specialist for Michigan's multi-tiered Systems of Support Technical Assistance Center, MiMTSS. And I am so privileged and honored today to be presenting alongside one of the most dedicated and professional educators and administrators that I've had the pleasure of working with. Starr, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name is Starr Lederer. I'm the principal at Weidman Elementary, which is part of Chippewa Hills School District. I also serve as the Title I coordinator for our district and as our Intensifying literacy instruction coordinator for the district.
Great. And I am truly honored to be presenting with Starr today. We're going to be talking about our journey, her journey at Weidman Elementary School. We've been working together on a model demonstration project of intensifying literacy instruction. And we have undergone this project in order to accelerate student outcomes. So today we're just excited to kind of share part one of our story with all of you. And so we hope you'll have questions. And I hope that maybe you can join us in some of our learning. So it's an honor to be able to talk to each of you today. There are many people that we have to thank for this work. We, first of all, need to thank the Chippewa Hills School District implementation team. They are just checking real quick. Is my screen messing up for everyone else, or is that just me? Let me unshare and then reshare. Okay. Goodness. Okay. Is it advancing okay on other people's ends? Okay. All right, let me know when it looks okay on your end. I'll move forward.
Looks good.
It looks okay. Is it advancing now normally?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So we want to thank a lot of people. I'm so sorry about that little technical glitch there. We worked really hard with the Chippewa Hills School District implementation team. They kind of provided a lot of the infrastructure and support for our work in Chippewa Hills and at Weidman Elementary School. All of the work that we have done has really been the result of the hard work of the teachers, the staff, and the students at the elementary schools in Chippewa Hills, and specifically at Weidman Elementary. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to every single person in those buildings. I also owe a personal thanks to the MiMTSS Intensifying Literacy Instruction Model Demonstration Implementation Team. Sorry, that's a mouthful, but they've provided guidance, support, vetting content for this project over the year. And then this work has actually been really informed by Michigan Department of Ed. This model demonstration was undergone kind of as part of the state systemic improvement plan that was submitted to the Office of Special Education Programs in DC. The goal was to come up with a process or a method that would intensify and accelerate outcomes for students with disabilities. And so this particular project was started in an effort to do just that. So this work is kind of guided by that state systemic improvement plan and by the leadership team who kind of put that together. Also, a lot of the stuff that we've worked on this year has come directly from the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Essential Practices Guide. It's available on the MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center website, mimtsstac.org, if you're interested in that. And then we also have a short video clip that we'll show to you later in the session. And we have to thank Charles Stanley, one of the teachers in the intermediate school in Chippewa Hills, for his excellent work on video production and kind of putting something together for us. It was just a huge gift to have that from him. The purpose today. So this year, Chippewa Hills School District has been partnering with MiMTSS to conduct a model demonstration of a program or a process called Data-Based Individualization, or DBI. And DBI is a systematic evidence-based process for intensifying literacy instruction. And so during this webinar, Starr and I will be sharing the implementation story of trying to implement DBI at Weidman Elementary School, and how that is beginning to lead to some accelerated outcomes for students with really significant and persistent needs in reading. We hope as you're participating in this webinar that you'll learn about some of the steps that Weidman team members have taken to implement data-based individualization, or DBI, and to intensify literacy instruction with their students. And then we'll examine some of the preliminary results of this DBI intensifying work. And we'll describe some of the challenges faced and some of the early lessons that we're starting to draw from this work in DBI intensifying implementation. Along those lines, we'll kind of start with kind of a background and purpose, give you a little bit of context for our story, and then we'll talk about specifically what we've done, the steps we've taken at Weidman, and then we'll share with you those preliminary outcomes, and we'll kind of end with some lessons learned, some real early lessons that we've pulled out. So with that kind of orientation there, I'm going to pass it over to Starr, who's going to tell you a little bit more about Chippewa Hills School District and Weidman specifically.
Okay, so Chippewa Hills School District, we encompass a large geographical area in central Michigan. We have roughly 1,850 kindergarten through 12th grade students, with about 68% of them being economically disadvantaged. As you can see on the picture on this slide here, our district includes 3 elementary schools, so each of those red stars is one of our elementary schools. The unique thing about our district is that each elementary is in a different rural town, which are anywhere from about 10 to 15 miles apart from each other. And our intermediate and high schools are located in the middle of these 3 towns. We also have a mosaic, our mosaic school, which is our alternative ed program, that is located in one of a different town, but also within our school district. Our district actually partnered with MiMTSS back in 2016. We have spent probably the last 5 years training and installing and implementing Tier 1 and 2 systems for PBIS and reading through this partnership. And before I begin talking about Weidman, I just want to say that our district has implemented DBI in all 3 of our elementaries. And really our purpose for just focusing in on Weidman Elementary during this presentation is just to give you an idea of what it looks like at the building level. And so a little background on Weidman Elementary. At Weidman, we have about 285 developmental kindergarten through 4th grade students, with about 69% of those students qualifying for free and reduced lunch. And we have 89% that are identified as at-risk students. We have 19 certified teachers, an administrator, which is myself, an amazing secretary, and we are very lucky in the aspect that we have 17 paraeducators, which really seems like a lot. However, 7 of those paras are in and with our special ed students, as we house our district's early childhood education program and our district's cognitively impaired classroom. We also house the district's DK program at Weidman Elementary. And so just like with the partnership with MiMTSS, we've also been working very hard to implement MTSS within our building. We actually were awarded the MiMTSS Silver recognition for the 2021 school year.
Yeah. So, as a school, Weidman had been working really hard, and Chippewa Hills School District had been working really hard to install all the elements of an MTSS system for reading and for behavior. And so they've been working really hard. And when we think about installing MTSS, we're kind of shooting for this image on the left here. We're looking for this ideal scenario that if we do everything right, tier one, and we give every single student in the building access to high quality reading instruction with systematic supports in place for behavior, universal behavior supports in place, that 80% of students should be able to meet those grade level benchmarks, those goals, and be successful with just that level of support. We know some students are going to need intervention. And so part of installing an MTSS system is to make sure that you have the supports and the interventions in place that students might need if it's not enough with just good tier one instruction. And then if you do that, if you do tier one right and you do tier two right, then there should only be a very, very small number of students who need who need intensive level support. I mean, our focus in this model demonstration was on that top of the pyramid, on that very tip top, providing that most intensive level of support. And we were kind of starting this work with Chippewa Hills. We reached out to them partially because they'd done so much work on the bottom part of the pyramid to install these things. And we were operating under this kind of idea that, okay, you build the foundation, then you build the next thing, and then now you'll be ready for this top thing. But coming into this year, as you all have probably experienced and know, we were coming in a really different moment, right? Despite all the incredible work that had been done in the past, we had a pandemic, and students were home they were virtual for part of the year in 2020, as you know, for the spring. And then last year they were virtual for 50% of the school year in Chippewa Hills. And it was kind of an off and on thing. So they were off and then they were on. And as a result, in literacy specifically, in the primary grades, K1 and 2, what we saw is that despite all the work that had been done to install this perfect system, we actually had a lot more students requiring this intensive level of support from the jump this year. So 55% of our primary students, K1, 2, coming into the year needed intensive level support. 15% additional students were below benchmark and definitely were going to need intervention. And only about 30% of the students were beginning the year where we would hope they would begin the year. So we were faced with a situation where, despite all the work we've been doing in the past, we came in to do this intensifying work with the pyramid flipped on its head. And so we really had to kind of rethink our model and rethink what we were doing. Because here we are, we were going to start the work on the top, even if the bottom of the pyramid wasn't in place. And some of the pushback around projects like our model demonstration is that this is really about a very small group of students, if everything were going to plan, right? But what we found was that this work is really about a large number of students this year. And so the work that we've done to intensify instruction in Chippewa Hills and specifically in Weidman has really pivoted to be about the majority of students, making sure that the supports that we have in place, the interventions we have in place are working for students. So we're operating in a really different context than we have before. And this kind of shows this kind of in a little bit more detail here, what exactly we were facing. This compares student scores from 2019-2020 school year, and then students from the 2020 to 2021 school year. As you can see, kindergarten students who hadn't been in school before, came into the year, both years, in a similar place, right? They're kindergarten, they hadn't been in school, they weren't infected by the pandemic learning loss situation. And so kindergartners were starting off at roughly the same place. But as you can see, by the middle of the year, before the pandemic, this was about the growth, right? This jump from down here to here in the mean benchmark score, composite score for all those kindergartners. Unfortunately, though, last year what we saw is that it was a much smaller jump from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year for kindergarten students. And in first grade, that became even more glaring because these students missed a portion of their kindergarten year, right? So they came in behind where previous first graders had been, and then they made less growth than first graders had made in the past. So this class that's currently the second grade class was really, really impacted by COVID-19 specifically. And maybe this speaks to what you're seeing in your own district and your own school. But it just kind of was the background for this project this year. On the one hand, we were kind of continuing this work to intensify instruction, but it just happened to occur at a moment when there was just more significant need than maybe any of us could have anticipated or expected. And so the focus of this work on accelerating and intensifying instruction has forced us to pivot from student problem solving to instructional problem solving. How do we meet students in this moment when they have such significant needs instructionally? What are we going to do to address those needs and to accelerate progress really in a way that we've never even accelerated it before? What can we do differently? And so we wanted to be really intentional about selecting those practices that were most evidence-based, most likely to accelerate outcomes. And so those were practices that had been replicated, had been in place before, had evidence of efficacy for students with significant needs, because we knew we had so many of those students. And so DBI was selected before the pandemic as a research-based systematic process for using data to determine when and how to intensify instructional supports. It is not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's not a silver bullet. In fact, it's very hard work. It's not an easy thing that you just throw in and you buy it off the shelf and you can put it in place with your students. Instead, it's a process. It's a cyclical process of slowly turning up the intensity of instruction until you find the just right support for individual students. But there is a lot of evidence for this process. There have been over 14 empirical studies, and they've shown an aggregate effect of about a third of a standard deviation, about G equal to 0.37. So that's a statistically significant effect. That's a positive effect. And quite frankly, it's kind of the best thing we have at the moment, right? When our other best tools fail, we can apply this process to try to make those tools work better for us. And so that was kind of the impetus behind or why DBI was selected by Michigan Department of Ed as a process that they wanted to test to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And now here we were applying it in Chippewa Hills in a situation where many more students, not just students with disabilities, were really in need of this level of support. Like I said, DBI is a process, so it's not a program, but it does rely on validated programs. So step one of the DBI process is matching students to validated standard protocol tier 2 interventions. So you start with something that is evidence-based, that has evidence of efficacy, that has been shown to accelerate outcomes. That's where you start. And then you progress monitor students as they're receiving that intervention or that kind of carefully scripted and crafted program to see how they respond. If students respond well to the program, fantastic. We keep them in that program. We just keep implementing it and we keep progress monitoring. We keep checking back in to make sure everything is going well. But when it doesn't work, then we kind of go into these bottom 3 steps. We collect additional diagnostic data, maybe functional assessment data on behavior, et cetera, to try to understand what's going on. Then we formulate and implement an intervention adaptation, and we collect additional data on that. And we start progress monitoring the students in this adapted form of the intervention. And then at regular intervals, we check in to see, did that thing work? And if that thing that we did worked, fantastic, we just keep doing it. And if it doesn't work, we go back to step 3 and we reformulate another plan. This whole process takes quite a bit of time. And it really can be quite difficult to implement in practice. So those 14 empirically validated studies, they really happened in research settings, right, with research support. And what we wanted to know in MiMTSS and from Michigan Department of Ed, we wanted to know what was this going to look like in a real life implementation, in an authentic setting, not with a bunch of researchers doing a lot of the work, but with real educators and real administrators in the middle of the challenges that are faced by everyone, kind of having to confront all those challenges. And so we wanted to know, could this process be applied at a systemic level feasibly? We wanted to know, could it be done with fidelity? Would we have to remove some barriers? What would those barriers be? And then what resources were going to be needed? What additional things were going to be needed by the districts and by the schools in order to put this into practice? And so part of this project and our goals as the center was to develop those resources, develop the training, develop the coaching, so that we could support other districts and schools in the future. But the most important goal of this project was to find out, would this accelerate outcomes for students with our most significant and persistent needs in reading? And so that was really, for us, the reason that we approached Chippewa Hills, a district that had been working really hard to install MTSS. And we asked them to partner with us in this model demonstration and kind of be, for lack of a better term, our guinea pigs, and try out some really, really hard work.
Yeah, and so when our district was approached about this partnership, we had felt that at the time that, with all the work that we had put in the past few years with tiers 1 and 2, that we were ready for the next step. We had been providing solid tier 1 instruction. We were providing tier 2 interventions for progress monitoring and adjusting interventions according to that progress monitoring data. But, we still had some students that weren't responding. And not only that, but we also knew that coming into the school year, we were going to see probably the largest number of students needing intensive supports in reading than we've ever seen before, because of the learning loss they experienced over the last couple of years with the pandemic. And so because of all that, we really needed to figure out other improvements we can make to our intervention system so that we can combat this huge reading deficit that we were about to incur. And so then at that point, our goals had become that we needed to improve our team's data-based decision making. So we needed to figure out how to collect and incorporate the fidelity data, the diagnostic data, and then also we needed to improve the way that we were using our progress monitoring data. We also needed to develop a professional learning plan for all of our teachers and paras that were going to be doing interventions, and also provide them with some coaching and feedback. And also, all of this would be for the benefit of supporting our students with intensive needs.
Yeah, and so it was kind of with both of those kind of shared goals that we kind of set off preparing to implement. So last May, actually, members of MiMTSS staff approached the Chippewa Hills district implementation team, MTSS district implementation team, and we asked them, do you think you'd be ready for this? Would you like to do this? And so they actually submitted an application to participate with us, which was very brave of them. And we had some very frank conversations with everyone involved about the work that was going to be included. We reviewed a lot of the work that the district had been doing over the last 4 years, and we looked at their organizational structure. We looked at their review and selection documentation. We looked at the interventions they had selected, the curriculums they had in place. We reviewed data from years past. We reviewed their communication protocols, and we had conversations with special education teachers and with principals. And we just kind of did an overall review to say, okay, what do we have? What's here? What are we going to need to do in the future? And Starr was part of a lot of those conversations at the very beginning, kind of figuring out, okay, what is in place in the district? What curriculum do we have? What else are we going to need? And then together we kind of worked out an implementation plan, and that became kind of a blueprint that guided the work at the individual buildings that has kind of taken the rest of the year. And so we started with kind of this district lens, kind of setting up some initial framework and some initial decisions that would make it possible for the schools to do what they needed to do after that. And then there were kind of two bins that needed to be kind of filled at the district level. Number one, we needed them to kind of okay our plan. Like, yes, we're okay with this. They needed to kind of give us a coordinator. And so Starr was brave and amazing for agreeing to do this work, because it has been an incredible amount of work on her end. But she was kind of tapped to be the Intensifying Literacy Instructional Coordinator. And then she was kind of the point person from that point on, and doing this work at the district level, but also then in her building too. So she's really been pulling double duty all year. And then we also wanted everybody in the district to see our plan and to kind of give approval and say, yeah, it's good. And then the other piece is that the district needs to be the ones who supply the staff, and they supply the resources. So they're the ones who purchase the curriculum. They're the ones who pay staff salaries. So we needed them to look at, to give approval to the resources that we need. And we needed them to kind of tap and specifically select those people who are going to serve on the team, the multidisciplinary team. That's the school-based team that oversees this work. And we'll talk a lot about that team in just a second. But they also needed to kind of provide some additional interventions and resources that we were going to need to make sure that the intervention system was complete. And there would be those targeted interventions that were necessary for all students. And then we also needed them to kind of approve the professional learning plan that, yeah, we're going to need these days set aside, these times, this amount. And so we needed them to kind of be on board with all of those pieces and basically kind of rubber stamp all of those pieces moving forward. And so we had 2 trainings over the summer with all members of the district implementation team, where we went over this stuff and they had the ability and the opportunity to see everything, to provide feedback, to shape what they wanted this to look like for Chippewa Hills. And yeah, and in that, Starr and I kind of formed this partnership. Starr, do you want to talk about some of what we've done in our coordinator check-ins?
Well, we've talked about just about how our MDT teams have rated the training that we've provided to them, and what improvements we can make for the upcoming trainings. We've also gone over an installation checklist to see where each elementary is at with installing ILI. And we also take time to look at the overall district levels of fidelity, their progress monitoring, outcome data, and we try to address any barriers we're seeing or that have been brought to our attention. Okay. So one of the first hurdles that we had as a district was that we had to narrow down the number of intervention programs that we were providing to our students. We, in the past, were providing many different intervention programs, and that really made it difficult to track the fidelity and to provide instructional coaching on. We had just adopted Wonders as our Tier 1 program a couple of years ago, and teachers were really just getting used to teaching that program. So what we needed was an intervention that wasn't going to be too difficult to learn how to implement, and we needed that program to be closely aligned to Tier 1 instruction, so that what students were taught in Tier 2 intervention time would actually transfer directly to Tier 1 instruction. And so for these reasons, we had selected ECRI for Wonders. ECRI stands for Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. We selected that for our kindergarten through 2nd grade students because that's what the program is validated for. This intervention has a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 component, and the daily lessons are very systematic, they're very explicit. They directly align with the daily reading skills that are in our Tier 1 program. For our 3rd and 4th grade students, we selected Phonics for Reading, which is another explicitly taught intervention. This program includes the foundational skills for reading when those skills are not necessarily in the Tier 1 curriculum anymore in 3rd grade and above.
Yeah,
and also, yeah, go ahead.
No, good. Yeah. And so along with those interventions that we wanted to kind of make sure those were our big bins of intervention, we needed a way to track student progress in interventions. And so in Chippewa Hills, they use the Acadian's data management system. And we went through and kind of over the course of the year, we've specifically prioritized certain measures for certain groups of students that we're using on a regular basis to track progress within the intervention. So in kindergarten, in the fall, we were using first sound fluency, and now in the spring, we're using phoneme segmentation fluency. For 1st grade, we've been using nonsense word fluency. We'll use that all year. And then in the spring of 1st grade, we started using oral reading fluency in addition to that measure, and we use that for all the other students 2nd through 4th grade to monitor progress. But the Phonics for Reading program actually also has some mastery measures built into it. So we can use those as another way to check progress in terms of their mastery within the curriculum itself that may not be totally picked up by those general outcome measures that we're using to monitor progress. And so these are some of the things that when we talk about that district training, this is what the district needed to provide. They needed to make sure that we had these pieces in place. So they had to go out and purchase ECRI materials and make sure that we had all of this in place. And then that would let us kind of develop a professional learning plan to make sure everybody was ready to do it.
Okay. So after narrowing down our intervention programs down to ECRI in grades K2 and phonics for reading for grades 3-4, our next hurdle as a district was to develop a professional learning plan. We needed to make sure that we had every single teacher and parapro trained in the intervention programs before the school year began. And the reason why we wanted everybody trained in the interventions is so that anyone who needed to be pulled to do an intervention would already be trained. We used Title II professional development funds to provide stipends to all the teachers and staff who participated in the 3 days of training because it was during their summer and we needed to entice them to actually come in off their summer break for the training. And then also, it had been a few years since our teachers were trained in the Acadians assessment program, so we needed to make sure that we provided refresher trainings for them, which we did towards the beginning of the school year. And then we also needed to make sure that teachers and paras who would be providing interventions would be provided with instructional coaching, both individually and through coaching conversations as a whole through refresher trainings throughout the year. We also needed to make sure that our professional learning plan included training for our MDT teams in intensifying literacy instruction. And we currently right now have all of our elementary special education teachers, along with a couple of gen ed teachers from each elementary that are receiving the letters training. And this is just to help us better understand the science of reading and what to do when students continue to struggle with reading. So after we tackled our professional learning plan, we really had to think about how some of our teaming structures were and what we needed to do to change some aspects of that. We had a school, we still continue to have a school leadership team, and that team leads us in implementing school-wide Tier 1 PBIS and reading assessments. We also have grade level problem solving teams in our buildings that are in place to help focus on Tier 1 reading instruction for their grade levels. We use STAT teams, which is kind of like your TAT teams. We did this to address individual student issues that was brought to the team by concerned teachers. And eventually that might lead to like a special education evaluation and an IEP, and those are kind of outside the MTSS framework. But what we were missing was a team that would oversee and monitor the intervention systems. Because we didn't really have a team like this in place, our grade level problem solving teams, whose sole focus is really supposed to be on Tier 1 instruction, they were the ones that ended up making the Tier 2 decisions to place students, monitor their fidelity, to track progress monitoring data, and to make intensification decisions. And so that's where the MDT team comes in. MDT stands for Multidisciplinary Team. This team is basically made up of the same people as our STAT team, but the difference is that the MDT team, we don't wait for the teacher to decide that a student needs support. Instead, the team is involved right from the start by overseeing and monitoring the intervention systems and by making informed decisions around intensifying interventions. And so by having an MDT team in place to oversee the advanced tiers, our grade level problem solving teams can now focus just on Tier 1 instruction.
Great. And I would just pull out here too, that one of the things that I've seen kind of in work, not just in Chippewa Hills and Weidman, is that this really is a very different model. So instead of kind of treating it as that everything goes up through the tiers, right, to the top if things aren't working, instead you have a team at the top where special education is fully integrated in the model, not outside of the model, but within the MTSS structure. And both from the bottom and the top, there's kind of this coordination around intervention and around supporting students, where every single staff member in the building is part of the tiered system, just like every single student is.
Right. Yep. And so we actually spent time over the summer establishing our MDT team and who was going to be on that team. We needed to make sure that we included people within our building and ISD that have expertise in assessment and data analysis, coaching, language, reading, and also behaviors. So the people that we have on each of our buildings MDT team, our school psychologist is on the team, social worker, speech and language pathologist, our special education teachers and intervention coordinators, the principal is on the team, and then also each of the buildings behavior interventionist is on the team. So each elementary has its own MDT team, okay? And so we needed to have, so the task that the MDT team has, the first task really is the one that we worked really hard on this year, and that was to increase the students' access to interventions. In the past, the way that we were doing our intervention programs, we only had about maybe 70 to 80% of our students who could access the interventions. And knowing that we were going to have more students than ever this year needing access to those interventions, that was our number one focus, was increasing that for them. Our next task was also to place students into groups. And then after that, we have to monitor the intervention system and then decide when and how to intensify instruction. Because we knew that we were going to have many more students needing interventions this year than last year, we needed to find a way to increase students' access to intervention. So in the past at Weidman, we had ran our interventions by grade level. So we actually had a different intervention time per grade level, and the grade level teams made the decisions about their students' interventions. Because we were doing intervention time by grade level, it really limited the amount of teachers and paras that we had available to do those intervention groups. And so Mecosta Elementary, which is one of our elementaries in Chippewa Hills, a few years ago, they had piloted an all hands on deck approach. And they had found out that by having the entire school doing interventions at the same time, that they were able to provide access to interventions for 100% of their students who needed it. So we decided to implement this approach across the district in all three of our elementaries. Our district calls this all hands on deck approach WIN time, which WIN stands for what I need. And basically at WIN time at Weidman, it occurs every single day at the same time for all students, teachers, and paras. At Weidman, we have our WIN time from 8:30 to 9, so we make sure that before 8:30, students are walking and teachers and paras are walking to wherever their intervention location is, and that they are in that intervention until 9 o'clock. They do not leave it until 9, just to ensure that we are the intervention is happening for the full half hour. Because students receive their interventions at the same time every day, we're actually able to utilize more teachers and staff, which this allows us to have more intervention groups, and thus we're able to provide 100% of our students who are not at benchmark with Tier 2 interventions. Those students not needing an intervention during this time are assigned to like their grade levels, like an enrichment classroom. And also because we have the entire school going to interventions at the same time, we were able to assign more groups for certain grade levels who have, say, more students that are at benchmark than others. And we could also group students based more on their ability level rather than what grade level they were in. So it's important to mention that as we increased the number of intervention groups we had, our MDT team also had to make sure that each group had all the materials they needed for the intervention and that each group had a location to provide the intervention in. And so, like I said, we established our MDT team over the summer, and we had these tasks that we needed to complete, okay? And so once we increased access to interventions, our next task was to place students in those interventions. And so after grade level teachers benchmarked all of their students in the fall, we used the Acadians reading assessment. The MDT team placed all students, including our special education students who scored below their grade levels benchmark, into a Tier 2 intervention group. And so our special ed students are also receiving Tier 2 interventions. We group these students according to need. Students with more significant needs, we actually try to place them into smaller groups. And then also we try to make sure that the teachers and paras that have like more expertise, that they're placed with those groups that have more significant needs. So after we placed our students into groups, the next step for our MDT team was to monitor the intervention system. And this is really where our MDT training and the DBI coaching that we received from Meagan really started to come in handy for us and started to make sense and kick in. Is, you know, trying to figure out how do we monitor our intervention system. You know, we needed what exactly do we need to know other than progress monitoring for students? What exactly do we monitor? And do we have access to the data that we need in order to monitor the system? And if we don't have access to that data, how do we get that data together, you know, so that we can monitor the system? And so monitoring the system meant that we needed to be looking at more than just outcome data. We needed to be monitoring student attendance and engagement in the intervention and whether or not they are receiving all of the components of the lesson, which was data that we didn't have access to because we didn't have a system in place for collecting this data. So we created implementation records for each teacher and para who were assigned to an intervention group. The implementation records include on them the date that the intervention is taking place. They fill in the start and end time and the lesson number. And then the intervention record already has the list of students that are in their group. And so on this record, they mark whether or not the student was there. They mark what level of engagement did the student present during the lesson. And then they also mark whether or not they were able to get through all the components. And then at the bottom of the record, there's a spot for notes. And so what we did is we created this document on Google Docs. And for each Google Doc, there's like 5 days worth of records on one sheet. We know that a lot of our paras don't necessarily have access to Chromebooks or technology during the day because they're working with kids most of the time. And so it's difficult for them to go and get on a Chromebook and try to fill this out. And so we printed them off for our paras. And so at the end of each win time, they would fill this out. And then at the very end of the week, these would be handed into our special ed teacher, who's also our interventionist teacher. And he would input all this information into a Google form for each of the groups. And then this Google form allows us to pull up spreadsheets, which does show us patterns in students' attendance and their engagement, and whether or not lesson completion data for each intervention group and each student is happening. And so we look at that implementation record data for each group to see if lessons are being delivered as planned, if there's any attendance concerns, if there's some engagement issues, is there any logistical issues, are they teaching for a full half hour, are they able to get through all the components, and if not, what do we need to do to make sure that they do get through them. So it gives us a bunch of data that we did not have access to before, and it's very valuable information. And then we also participated in instructional coaching and observation, and that's where Meagan really helped us out with that. And so I'll let her speak on that more.
Yeah. And so those implementation record data really gave us a lot of self-report data from the interventionist about how it was going to allow us to address logistic barriers and behavioral barriers that were coming up in intervention from the jump, right? Before progress started to wane, we could step in early and support. The other piece of this is that we wanted to know fidelity in a kind of a deeper level. These were brand new programs to a lot of the interventionists, and a lot of our interventionists were paraprofessionals. And so they'd never implemented instruction before. And so we really wanted to kind of provide some support and help them kind of really master the instruction in these programs. And so we wanted to know, how are they kind of adhering to the routines as they're supposed to be done? Are they applying like evidence-based instructional practices in terms of classroom management, organization of materials, stuff like that? And so I live in Kalamazoo. Chippewa Hills is a couple hours away from me. It's not feasible for me to be in all three buildings to provide, to do these fidelity observations on a daily basis. And so we actually used kind of video technology. We used a little robot that could videotape each of the interventionists while delivering the interventions. That sits behind the students and just picks up the instructor's voice. And it allows me to kind of watch from my office in Kalamazoo how everyone's doing. And I am able to collect additional fidelity data on each of the routines and all the components of the routines. And then I use that data, not necessarily in a really structured, like punitive way or anything like that, but we just have kind of really open-ended coaching discussions. So we'll meet virtually kind of the day after they're observed. And we just talk about what I saw, what they're experiencing in their groups. The interventionist has the opportunity to set a goal and decide what they want to work on. And we use this data to kind of inform, as a team, an MDT team, we sit and kind of think about whole picture wise from the data. Okay, what other professional learning do we need? Maybe we need to go back and reteach blending. That's one thing that we found we needed to do. Or, where we're having a lot of trouble with the like error correction, check for understanding, student response procedures. So we provided some additional learning around that. We gave people a little check sheet to help them with that. And then also okay, they need a little more modeling here, or somebody needs to go and observe. And so this has just allowed us to provide support for the interventionists before it needed to be identified, right? Before the student started to flounder, or before the interventionist was floundering. But I have so much respect for Chippewa Hills staff, because this was totally new. And I was totally new to them. And being videotaped is very scary. And they have been so open to this process and to improving and to getting better. And it's just been really fun to see how that has played out for everyone, and how that's helped everyone establish really good fidelity to make sure that the way they're implementing intervention is almost exactly identical to the way it's happening tier one. And so there's this really tight transfer between the classes. And it's just been really exciting to see how the program is less important than how you do it. And implementing with fidelity can lead to some really important and good things. And also, everybody in the building who's doing these interventions then has the opportunity to be truly excellent at what they do. And that's kind of been exciting to see. And then, the other piece of that, not only do we want to know that they're doing all the instructional components correctly, right? We also need to be able to monitor students' progress. And, things like winter break happen, snow days happen, things happen. And it's really easy for progress monitoring data to kind of fall off. For students to be absent, or for their quarantine, or other situations or issues, or maybe to not collect data on a certain measure for certain students. You don't realize they need it. There were so many students who needed to be progress monitored that one of the tasks of the MDT is just making sure that the progress monitoring data is being entered every single week as it's supposed to be. So this is an example of kind of that synthesized data from, we have a check sheet that has like who's supposed to get monitored each week. And we can go in and say, okay, did it get in? Did it get in? Did it get in? Did it get in? And we can make sure, is everybody getting the correct measures? Are they on the right schedule? And then when barriers come up, for example, the teacher at the top here didn't have access to the right place to put their data in. And so it was just a matter of like, oh, we need to get you access. We need to help you get those measures. We need to make some copies for you, help you get set up. And the next week, after we saw this in the MDT meeting, we were able to get that set up for them. And they had 100% data entry, because that's what allows us to make good decisions about how students are progressing and what's happening for them in intervention. And one other piece of this is that we're then able to group the students in our progress monitoring software in Acadience. And that allows us to make sure that, students we're looking at their progress at a group level, and that we're able kind of to look big picture. And so the MDT is kind of doing all of these things behind the scenes to monitor the system, make sure everything is set up, so that then we can do kind of our next task, which is determining when we need to intensify instruction.
Yeah, so our Our next task as an MDT, like Meagan said, was to decide when do we intensify instruction, okay? And so the process was actually very confusing at first. And so we asked Meagan, like, how can we make this a little more clear and just have like step by step of exactly what do we do, you know? And so she was so kind to make this flow chart for us, which it just kind of made it all click. And now we definitely understand it much better. So after we spent time monitoring the intervention system, we need to take time during our MDT meetings to make decisions about when to intensify. And so to do this, we pull up our student progress monitoring graphs and we look to see if there's 3 data points since our last instructional change. If there are not since the last instructional change, then we do not make any changes to the intervention. But if there is, then we move on to the next step, which is to look at the student's cadence data and decide if, or not a cadence data, I'm sorry, we look at the student's attendance data and look to see if they were present and engaged for 70% or more of the intervention sessions. If they weren't, then we cannot make any instructional changes yet. We make other decisions around that. But if they are, then we move on to the next step, and which is to look at the students' progress monitoring graphs. And so we need to look to see if any of the last 3 data points are on or above the student's goal line. The goal line is from where they started at the beginning of the year, and it goes diagonally all the way to the end of the year benchmark expectation for that skill. So if they have, of the last 3 data points, if they have any of them at or above the goal line, then we do not make any changes yet to their intervention. Because that tells us it's probably working, or we need to give it more time to see if there's more progress monitoring points that'll be above the goal line. But if there is not any above at or above the goal line, then we pull up the group data that we have in Acadians, and we look to see if is it the entire group that's not making progress, or is it just the individual student that's not making progress? Okay. And so right here is an example of the first step of the decision tree, which is, are there 3 data points since the last instructional change? And so as you can see, there's this vertical blue line right here. And that is, we had entered in that we made an instructional change here for this student. And so as you can see, there's only been 2 data points since that instructional change. And so we would not do anything yet to change the intervention, okay? We would need more data. And so the second part of our decision tree, where we look at student attendance and engagement, this is an example of when we pull up our implementation record spreadsheet for each group. We're able to see some patterns for each student. So like, as you can see, student number 1, there's they are not at 70% or more of being in attendance or engaged in the lesson. But the other 3 students are. So for this student right here, you know, if they're not making any progress, and they haven't been here or been engaged, then we can't really change the intervention, because that's not telling us that the intervention isn't working. Okay, there's some other reasons there. But if they are present for 70% or more, then we would move on to the next part of the decision tree, which is where we look at the goal line data. So this chart on the left here, you can see this student is doing amazing. That diagonal blue line is their goal line data, and all the data points are above the goal line, okay? So this student's probably exited from intervention, I'm sure. But then if you look up over to the top right, it's the same thing. You know, they're actually trending upward, and even though they got a couple that are below the goal line, they still have many that are above. So we wouldn't make any instructional changes for this student. But then now the graph on the bottom here, the bottom right, This is where we're going to look and say, oh, yeah, there's quite a few progress monitoring points below the goal line. So we need to decide, then we need to look at the group progress monitoring graphs, okay? So when we pull up the group progress monitoring graph, the one on the left, we can see that each of these lines is an individual student. And so the graph on the left here, we can see that basically the entire group is not making progress, okay? So that tells us that it's not an individual intensification that needs to be made. That whole group needs some sort of intensification or some sort of strategy for that group in order to begin to make progress towards reading. But now the graph on the right here, you can see that the majority of the students in the group are making great progress, but then we have one student who's just flatlined and no progress at all, okay? And so this would be an example of how we would make a decision to just do intensification for just that student, okay?
Yeah, so determining when to make a change, that's everything that leads up to that. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And so the Weidman team, as you've heard Starr describe, has done a ton of work getting kids set into interventions, making sure every single student is accessing them as they're supposed to, making sure fidelity is high, that progress monitoring is being conducted as it's supposed to be, and sitting down together and deciding, okay, who needs a change? What should we change? Like, when should we make these changes? The kind of final step that the MDT has and is responsible for is determining how to change instruction. And this is not to take away from any of the previous bodies of work, but this is really complicated stuff. Once you've decided, yeah, we need to make a change, now what do we change? And we want to make sure this is a data-informed decision about what we do. And so we try to collect as much diagnostic data as we have to form a hypothesis, something actionable that we can change that's directly related to why we think the root cause of that lack of progress is. So what instructional thing are we doing that we need to fix to make this work better? And that helps us determine a dimension of instructional intensity that we can target. And so we could potentially increase the behavioral support in the intervention. We could increase the comprehensiveness or how explicit the instruction is. We could increase the support for transfer or generalization within the intervention. We might change the progress monitoring measure. If we felt like, yeah, growth is happening, but we're just not picking it up because we're not using the right measure, we might kind of address that component. Or we might decide, hey, we're not even hitting all the things we're supposed to hit for this student. We need to change the alignment of this intervention. Or actually, we're hitting a whole bunch of stuff this student has already mastered. We need to stop practicing that and practice some other things. Or we might just increase the dosage because we feel like we're doing everything right, but the student just needs more opportunities to practice and more time in intervention in a smaller group setting to make this work. But the key is we don't want to do all those things at once because that would not be sustainable, right? If we make every single change, then we can't really collect fidelity data on it. It's impossible to sustain. And that won't last forever. Like, we can't send them to intermediate school, to middle school and say, yeah, keep doing this that we're doing over here, this incredibly impossible thing. That's just not going to work in the secondary setting, right? So it's important that we just make 1 to 2 small changes at a time so we can see if that thing is the thing that works, because our goal is to figure out that perfect match for this kid that's going to start accelerating their outcomes. We want to find that just right level of support. I like to think of it like a soundboard, like we're slowly moving up little pieces of instructional intensity until we get that just right match. And this is really where our MDTs are right now. We're having meetings every week. In addition to those other tasks that they've been doing all year, now we're starting to have these really deep conversations. We're involving general ed teachers too. We're involving parents to try to make these decisions about how are we going to intensify instruction. And we need to make sure that what we decide to do, we implement immediately so we can see what happens. And we mark that change. We put a dark blue line in Acadians to see what does that do? Does it make the change we want for our students? Does it result in something better? And if it doesn't, then we come back and we make another change. And then we look. Does that give us what we want? And so that's kind of where we are right now, is kind of figuring out the how of intensifying instruction. And so that's kind of an overview of all the incredible amounts of work that the Weidman team has been doing. And they've been doing this work too at Mecosta and at Barrett and the other 2 elementary schools in Chippewa Hills. Mm-hmm. and it's just been fascinating and amazing to watch all this work taking place. And it's a lot, but we're just starting to get some glimmers of some outcomes. And so Starr and I felt like it would be really helpful to kind of see this. We've given you a lot of details here, but to see this in action, what this looks like in Chippewa Hills. And so with that, I'm going to ask that we start a little video here that's going to show you in real time what this looks like in Weidman and in the other two buildings in the district.
My name is Starr Lederer, and I am the principal at Weidman Elementary.
Hi, my name is Kyle Liska. I am the elementary principal at McCosta Elementary School.
I'm Amanda Kimball. I'm the principal at Barretton Elementary School.
So at the end of last school year, we knew we were going to have a high number of students needing to recoup the large amount of learning they lost due to the pandemic.
As we know, with COVID, we've had lots of setbacks as far as reading scores. So that was a daunting task, but my staff did a really nice job getting that process ready.
To start this year, we were so far below where we would normally come in to start a year, with student loss and being at home and virtual learning that we had to kind of navigate last year.
In the past, we would offer many different Tier 2 intervention programs that many of our teachers and paras were not trained in. Only about 75% of our students who needed interventions had access to Tier 2 interventions. We did not have a process in place for checking implementation fidelity. We were basically basing our decisions to intensify interventions solely on whether or not the student was making progress.
And so what we did is we overhauled our entire Tier 2 system so that we could get every student that had reading deficiencies, we could get them the intervention that was appropriate.
This year, we've made the commitment to stick with just one Tier 2 intervention program that directly aligns with our Tier 1 reading program. And we ensured that 100% of our teachers and paras were trained in teaching the program before the school year began.
Support staff and teachers have been trained in the models that we are delivering with intervention, so phonics for reading and ECRI, or Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. That is a supplement to our Wonders Reading Core Curriculum.
Every teacher and para that has a Tier 2 group is receiving instructional coaching throughout the year to ensure that the program is being taught as intended.
We started 2 different win times. It stands for What I Need, which means that all students in the building stop instruction at different points throughout their day and go and receive 30 minutes of reading intervention.
The main thing is making sure that we have them, that the groups are happening every single day, that the interventions that they're doing are the ones that they've been trained in, and that we're collecting the fidelity data needed on those interventions.
That's probably been the biggest thing that we've looked at this year, is having implementation data around, hey, are we getting to all the points of our intervention and what our students actually need? And then, are they making gains or not making gains based on because they're not here, because they don't have access to maybe the last comprehension piece, and so their comprehension is still struggling, but 4 days out of the week we're missing that piece because we never collected that fidelity data.
Most of the year we have spent getting all of these components in place for Tier 2, so we are now at the point where we are beginning to make informed decisions to intensify interventions.
Students have been responding really well. We benchmark all of the students 3 times a year using Acadience data, and then from there we have a multidisciplinary team that meets every single week. We look at that progress monitoring data. We do quick training sessions with support staff and teachers if we notice that something isn't getting done in one of their routines throughout that time. So we are constantly doing professional learning based on what that information gives us, and then also tracking how the students are responding.
Because of everything we have put in place this year to beef up our Tier 2 interventions, we have seen much more growth from fall to winter in reading proficiency that we have ever seen in the past.
And to almost be back to pre-pandemic numbers is just truly remarkable, given all the things that our teachers and staff have, and our students have had to overcome.
It's been really nice, even though I'm one elementary out of all three in the district, all of us are doing things very similarly, so that's been nice because we do share a lot of students that come and go between the three elementaries, even though we're geographically quite a ways apart. That has been really nice to be able to have similar processes, so we know that we're all doing the same type of work around intensification and literacy.
Change is always hard for anybody. This is a process that took, for our building, it's been in the works for about 4 years to get to this point, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to keep moving as long as you're moving forward. Getting students where they need in that intervention. Being bold and saying, hey, what we're doing is good, but we could be better for our kids, for our community, and for our staff. It's not always fun to get there, but the rewards for our kids and our community is definitely worth it.
Awesome. And I just loved that video, hearing the principals, each talk about it on their own and kind of come to similar conclusions was just really exciting to see across these three schools where the work has been equally, complex and difficult and hard for everybody. Lots of changes, lots of things asked of staff. And it was interesting that all three of them were kind of seeing similar things starting to show up across the building. So it was just really fun seeing that as someone who's been observing them all year, to see that everyone was getting to that place together. And with that, we're seeing some really exciting things in terms of implementation, in terms of in outcomes. So what the staff is doing. So 125 students at Weidman in particular came into the year needing intervention. And of those 125 students, every single one of them is getting intervention every single day. There are 20 intervention groups that are happening during that win time that Starr talked about. Every day they're happening. And that's really exciting to see. That implementation record and fidelity data shows us that it's not only are they happening, but they're happening with a high degree of fidelity. So all the interventionists are getting those sessions done with higher than 95% completion rate. So that means that they're getting to every activity every single day on a really regular basis. And that's really exciting to see. And then as I've watched the interventionists providing these interventions, they've had higher than 74% fidelity, which is actually really exciting and fun to see because in the field, above 60% is really exciting to see. And this is with people who have not delivered these interventions in the past. Some of these people are brand new to delivering intervention. I mean, they might be 18 or 19 years old and they just graduated from high school. I mean, it's really exciting stuff to see the level of fidelity that they've been able to get to so quickly in their intervention delivery. And everybody's been participating in the instructional coaching. It was so scary at first for a lot of individuals, but everybody really opened themselves up to it. And I have just been excited to see the staff kind of open up and be willing to try new things and to approach instructional problem solving rather than student problem solving, and kind of treat this as okay, how does my instruction get better rather than how do the students get better? And then as a result, students are getting better. So it's been really exciting to see that implementation that happen. And the multidisciplinary teams at each of the buildings have been working so hard. The Weidman multidisciplinary team in particular is working so hard to do all of those things. They're every single week meeting, going through tons of data, having really complicated and difficult conversations. They've done a lot of training. They've done 7 out of the 8 kind of specific multidisciplinary team training sessions. And then in addition to those, science of reading letters trainings and all the other trainings that are going on. So it's just been an incredible amount of work and they're getting it done. And that in and of itself kind of speaks to our first goal, which was to see, is it feasible to implement data-based individualization in authentic settings? And what we're seeing is that, yes, it is feasible to implement. Not easy, but it is feasible and they're doing it. And it's really exciting to see. And it's starting to lead to some pretty cool outcomes. So I'll let Starr tell you about these. Starr, did I lose you?
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's definitely paying off, all of this hard work. We have really seen a lot of growth with our students, particularly kindergarten and first grade. These are the kids that are probably making the most growth that we're seeing. And we have less students now in interventions than what we did in the fall. So we're actually exiting kids from interventions, which is really nice to see. Our second grade group is probably our most, they were hit the hardest with the pandemic. And that's because, their kindergarten year, was when we shut down in March. In their first grade year, half of it was virtual. And so this year, and plus this year, we've had whole class quarantines, we've had individual student quarantines, even their teachers have had a quarantine. And so it's been very difficult for our second grade, but they have at least, maintained the amount of students that are proficient, which is awesome. But they are, it's difficult because these are the students that when they were virtual, they were virtual at an age where it was very difficult. When you're in kindergarten, first grade, it's very difficult to do virtual work. And so, but now with our third or fourth graders, they're a little bit older. We had, probably 65% of our third graders and 65% of our fourth graders were proficient coming to us in the fall. And we really kind of attribute that to, even though we were virtual for, about half the year last year, they're more able to do some of that virtual work, for our younger kids, it's too difficult unless you have somebody sitting right there with them to assist in helping them do that. So, but they were still able to maintain the number of students that they have proficient. And then, comparing this to previous years, by percentage, as you can see over here on the left of this column is, by school year here. And then we have, during those school years, what was the fall proficiency like with Acadians? And then in the winter, what was the proficiency level at that point? And then the last column shows us, was there an increase or a decrease? And as you can see this year, we've increased our proficiency, the percentage of students being proficient in reading by 11%, which is the most that we've ever done. So this is very exciting for us. And even, you could say it's because these kids came in so low, and so, it's a little bit easier to make growth that way. But if you look in 2012 and 13, only 37% of our students were proficient coming into us. And, we only made, we didn't make as much growth as what we made this year. So I really do think that everything that we've done this year to shore up our tier 2 systems, our intervention systems, has really helped recover the learning loss that these kids endured over the last couple of years. So,
yeah. And as we've been able to look like whole system wide at all the students in the system, right? And we're seeing more students moving from not proficient to proficient. When we look closely at those students who came in with the most significant persistence needs, so those students who are kind of below the 20th percentile for the district, and we were specifically interested in what's going on for these students. These are the students who we would have expected to maybe have to intensify our supports for going forward. And as we look at those students, Acadians gives us this great measure called the Pathway of Progress, and it allows us to compare those students to students who started the year at the same spot, right? So when we look at that information, how much growth would we expect them to make compared to other students across the country who start at this place, with a score of 0 on this measure, what do we expect them to do? And so only 10% of those students, there were about 52 students in the district who were in this bottom 20th percentile range, only 10% of those students made below typical expectations. And so the remainder of those students either made typical or above typical, and actually a majority of those students made above typical progress compared to nationally other students who started where they started. That's really exciting because it means that those students are essentially beating the odds. And when we look back in time at how those students did last year, only one of those students made typical progress. Every other student in the group made below or well below typical progress when they were compared to their peers. So it just really kind of speaks to how this approach has helped a lot of students district-wide, but it's really starting to help. And it's showing up for those students who had the most significant persistent needs, including many, many of our students with disabilities. So that has been really exciting to see. And when we look at growth comparisons, I showed you that graph at the very beginning of our presentation, kind of showing the impact of the pandemic. This shows kind of our first semester growth by grade level, and you can see how different this picture looked for our first graders and kindergartners and second graders last year. You can see how different the growth was for the year that they were at home with the pandemic. But we see this year in kindergarten, we see more growth than we saw pre-pandemic. In first grade and second grade, we're really seeing similar growth to what we'd seen pre-pandemic. And that's speaking to this idea of like, we're getting these students, some of those students were really hit hard. You can see how little growth occurred for our first graders who are home, our current class of second graders. And so the fact that they're making the growth that they need to in second grade really speaks to the fact that we're meeting them where they're at. And then we're starting to kind of regain some of that lost ground with them, which is really exciting. And in terms of how we've intensified, back in November, actually, our first group that we intensified, it wasn't an individual student put on a plan, but it was actually all of second grade. So we knew that they were the most impacted grade coming into the year. Their first fall benchmark data confirmed this. And then they were hit again. They were hit, the whole grade at Weidman, the whole second grade was actually quarantined for COVID cases in October. So they just kind of, the hits kept coming. And when we got to the end of October and we looked at their first kind of set of progress monitoring data, the first like solid month that they had, none of them had made any growth. And so it really forced us to kind of take stock as a team. And we realized we needed to adjust alignment because they'd missed so much instruction during first grade and kindergarten. We needed to go back and catch them up on those skills. We needed to go address those gaps in background knowledge that they had. And so we actually placement tested all of our second graders. We put them all into like kind of a fast track version of the curriculum and took them back. And then we also put a lot of additional support in terms of fidelity coaching and training into second grade, specifically put some additional bodies in second grade, move people around to intensify support in that grade level specifically. And so that already we're seeing that most of the second graders then made above typical progress or well above typical progress as a result of kind of adjusting our supports and making that intensification. And so that was an exciting kind of first step into intensifying. And it's exciting now that we're kind of starting to move beyond whole group level to individual problem solving and trying to figure out what to do next. And it's really teaching, I know myself, a lot. And I'm learning so much in this process. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to learn alongside Starr and her whole team at Weidman.
Yeah. And it's not to say that it didn't come without some challenges. You know, we've had quite a few. It has been very challenging. The biggest thing is just, you know, the staff shortages because of staff illnesses or quarantines, and also, you know, what everybody is experiencing in the world right now, which is lack of sub shortages or lack of subs. Which creates a shortage. And so sometimes it can be difficult to make sure that all of our intervention groups are being covered when we do have, you know, so many absences during certain parts of the school year. But we're actually on the upswing with that. So that's been awesome. And then also, you know, just the staff burden that it's put on everybody. They have been implementing new initiatives this year. Participating in virtual observations and coaching with a program that they've never taught before. And so that could be very intimidating for them, but yet they trucked right through it. And then just, you know, having so many more students to try to support with such high needs than we've ever had before, you know, that's been quite burdensome. And then another thing is just, you know, when you have so many different intervention groups happening, is making sure that you have enough resources for them. And so, you know, just like the intervention manuals, you know, decodables, sound spelling cards, you know, all those things that is needed for each group. So, you know, that's been a little bit of a challenge too, but we, you know, work our way around that, and that helps. So some of the lessons I think that we've learned, well, the biggest one I think for us, I think, is just how important implementation fidelity really is, and that, you know, you can't just make decisions based off of whether or not students are making progress. Because really the progress monitoring scores are only telling us whether or not they're making progress. It's not telling us why. And so now we have data that we can look at that is telling us like what might be causing the lack of progress. And we're able to make more informed decisions based off of that data and how to intensify literacy instruction for those kids.
Yeah, and despite those challenges that Starr talked about, the team at Weidman and at each of the elementary schools really in Chippewa Hills has been doing some really incredible work, even though it's been so hard. And what I worried about coming into this year was that the work that we were going to do on this top of the pyramid stuff, the intensive intervention and DBI support, that if we did this work, it was going to hurt the work that they've done in the earlier tiers. And what I've learned so far is that actually, rather than hurting the other tiers and taking away kind of resources from those, it's actually resulted in improvements to the lower tiers. And I've started to see it like renovating your house, right? When you dig in to put something in, you realize, oh, we got to put some new wiring in, we got to shore up the foundation, we got to do these other pieces. And that's really what's happened. Like the work we've done has shored up tier one and improved the instruction of that tier one curriculum, the Wonders curriculum. It's kind of pushed stuff back to the grade level problem solving to figure out like, how can you do this better at tier one? Tier two has definitely gotten stronger as a result of this work. And we're seeing a lot more implementation at tier two. So it's just been really exciting to see that you can do this work. You can come into your work installing your MTSS system from both angles. You don't have to wait until you have perfection in tier one and tier two. You don't have to wait till 80% of your students are on benchmark before you can think about this. And that's been really exciting to see. I know from my vantage point. And then it's also been, we talk about those challenges on teachers. When you present people with the data on how students are doing, teachers are amazing and they want to fix everything right away. And so it's really hard to take a minute to let 3 weeks of data accumulate to see that, oh, actually that was just a bad week. The student had a bad day on the playground and then their progress monitoring score is not, we should not use that. Or that was just a bad probe. They really are much higher than that. It's hard to wait. And then it's even harder to not want to change every single thing right away. So everybody's like, well, but we got to change this in tier one. We got to change this over here and change this over here. And it's really hard to do that. And it's, the go-to for everyone is to think that the programs need to just be thrown out, that we should just throw this curriculum out, get a new one that's better because this one doesn't work. And what this is pushing on is like, how do we make the programs we work better? And what, instead of changing out the program, how can we improve our instruction in the programs we're using to make them stronger, more intense, better aligned to the student within that program. And also, like, we kind of have this tendency to be like, more dosage, like provide an additional session of the day, extra minutes, one-on-one. That's not sustainable. And trying to figure out a better way to do that, to work really smarter instead of just kind of really working harder. We want to work a little bit smarter. And in that, I've learned that I need to provide some decision guidance. I would say, right, Starr?
Yeah, and actually that's what, has, like looking back, if we had like, the decision tree beforehand and I could have like shared that with teachers, to say, hey, the reason why we haven't done anything yet is because we need to have this in place first, so I think that would have helped probably explain to them, that, hey, we are doing a lot of work right now. But we need to, before we just make a decision about what we're going to do with students that aren't making progress, we got to make sure that we are doing everything that we said we were going to do during that intervention time. So
yeah, and through it all, I've been blown away. I've been just amazed by the resilience, the fortitude, and the excellence of the Weidman students and staff. I think that every single body in that building has been doing some of the hardest work at possibly the hardest time in educational history. It's just been a really unique and challenging moment to do that work. And so from here, this is just the first steps. We're just at the early stages of this model demonstration. Now we are developing and implementing those individual intensive intervention plans. We're really starting to get into the DBI process for individual students. We're trying to maintain fidelity and keep it going, keep pushing forward. And then we're trying to figure out, how do we sustain this into the future? Are we going to need more interventions? Are we going to need more resources? And then where do we go? Once we have this infrastructure in place for reading, do we scale it up to math? Do we scale it up to the secondary level? What's our next steps? And so I'm excited by the early results. I'm excited by what I'm seeing so far. And I'm excited to see where Weidman takes it and Chippewa Hills takes it, and how this will impact students with disabilities, not only in Chippewa Hills, but also across the state of Michigan as well.
Absolutely.
So with that, I want to open it up for questions. So Melissa, sorry, I wasn't able to watch the chat, so I'll let you kind of funnel some questions our way.
Hey everybody. So one of the questions that came up early on was, could you explain a little further about how you give interventions to all students who need it at the same time?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy. So we took Acadian's data from the behavior, those benchmark scores, and we made basically tables of every single student who had a score that was below benchmark. And we ordered those tables and we said, okay, let's see how many staff members we have. We have this many staff. Okay, we want groups of about 4 to 5 students max. And we said, okay, let's move staff wherever we need to get everybody to the place that they need to be. And so it took a lot of time. I mean, it was like day-long meetings of like with the system and moving paras from one setting into another setting, moving teachers around, figuring out how we could do this. And that's not to say this is the only way. At Barrington and Mecosta, they've had actually different ways of addressing this issue. And Barrington, for example, they made 2 different time slots, basically one for intermediate and one for primary. So they could use all the paras at both time slots. So basically that was how they had to address it, because they needed more groups and they had paras and bodies to do it. And that's what they did. But that's where having a team that's doing this rather than each of the grade levels working alone has been actually really, really cool to see.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question that came up is, are you doing tier 3 interventions? How does that work?
Yeah, so tier 3 interventions, the intensive interventions, is essentially taking what we're doing tier 2 and then deciding, okay, how do we intensify this piece by piece? So for example, there's a kindergarten student who wasn't making progress in the tier 2 intervention that we needed. So the intensifications, we realized his phonemic awareness was not coming along where we wanted it to come. So we added in an intensive phonological awareness intervention on top of the other piece that he's getting. And so that's how we intensified his intervention. For second grade, the whole grade, for example, we took them actually through a fast track version. So it's like the whole grade went to tier 3 essentially for a portion of the year. And now some of those groups are starting to come out of it and are returning to just tier 2 alone. And eventually we'll be back to that. So it's looked different. Sometimes it's behavioral support that we've intensified for a specific student. So it's the same intervention, the tier 2 intervention, with a lot more behavioral pieces kind of plopped into that time for them. So different parts of it are being kind of intensified for different groups and different students. And so it doesn't necessarily mean a different intervention is the tier 3 intervention. It's the same intervention. We're just tweaking pieces of it to make it work better for those individual students.
So it could look different for each child who needs the individualization based on what their specific needs are.
Yeah,
but they're still in the same common intervention.
They're still in the same. We do have different, I will say, the CI classroom. So the classroom for students who have more significant and severe impairments, that room is using a different curriculum than they're using in the other settings. But similarly, like we're using that as the base curriculum and then we're intensifying that. So we're taking pieces of that and tweaking it rather than throwing it out, because there is no silver bullet curriculum out there that would be perfect and would fix everything for everybody. It's not there yet.
Awesome. Another question that came up is what role do families play in this work?
Yeah, this is a tricky one that we're working through, and we're trying to figure out where this goes. Because at the beginning of this phase, it's been messy. And when it's whole groups that need to be intensified, like the whole of second grade, we couldn't bring in every second grade parent and say, okay, now that we're in this giant gymnasium, let's figure this out together, right? Now we're in a point where we're starting to say, okay, let's bring in the parent. Let's get them into this meeting. Sometimes that means addressing some attendance issues And in those cases, the parent definitely has to be part of that discussion. And we're trying to figure out ways to address it. Ideally, the parent should be an equal player when we get to this individualization step, that they should be just as much a part of this program in determining how. I like to think of it like your IEP, right? We require that parents be present at those meetings to sign off. They have procedural safeguards to make sure to protect their students' right. The IEP says the student needs support. This plan says how we're going to provide that support. It gets into the nitty-gritty details of this many minutes of handwriting, this many minutes of this many minutes of this provided by this person in this room with this curriculum. Like, it gets very nitty-gritty with this specific behavioral support. And it changes then every time there's not progress. So then we are constantly revising it rather than once a year when we have that IEP meeting. But it really looks like an IEP team where it's a co-designed time and the parent is part of that and says, okay, this isn't working. I think we should try. And ideally, that's where we want to get to, but we're just getting there with our individual plans.
Another question that just came in is, how much time is spent teaching Tier 1 reading / phonics? How much intervention time each day? So both Tier 1 and how much time?
We have 90 to 100. We have to ensure 90 to 120 minute reading blocks at each of our elementaries for all of our kids. Yeah.
Yeah. And the cool thing about using a program like ECRI is that they actually do a 30-minute lesson, Tier 1, that's the phonics pulled from Wonders. So it's the exact like words, decodables, everything pulled out of Wonders and like just kind of put onto it to make sure they get to all those pieces every day in their, their 120 minutes of reading. That part of that is doing that. And then there's some small group time in there where they might read those decodables again. And then during intervention, they're actually getting a pre-teach of the lesson to help those students be successful during the time. So they're getting an additional 30 minutes of like that intensive phonics time to support what they're doing in Tier 1.
Another question that came in is, are you incorporating the interventions as part of the student's IRIP if they have one?
Mm-hmm. yeah. That's what's frustrating because some of it's like duplicate work, and so our district has like an IRIP form that we use, which looks very similar to our intensification form that we're using for students when we decide that we need to intensify interventions for them. And so it's kind of funny because we just kind of transfer that information over to the IRIP. But eventually I would think that, we would just, that intensification form is what we would use instead of the IRIP form. It's the same thing, basically, except it's way more detailed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, we're finding that there's like these duplications, right? You got your stat team, you got your MDT team, you got your IEP team. And really this is about making those teams one team and saying, okay, what are we doing to support students? And it doesn't matter if you call it an IRIP or you call it an intensive individual, like what the title on the top says. What matters is what's in there. And so that's what we're doing, is making sure that we're setting a course, we're making a plan, and we're adjusting that plan in a really systematic way for individual students.
All right, and one last question, because I know we're at the end of the time. What do enrichment activities look like that for the students that are in that who don't need the Tier 2 interventions?
Oh my! So actually, those classrooms are quite a bit larger because there are higher reading kids. But they'll do like readers theater. They do maybe some advanced parts of the Wonders program that maybe they're not doing with the whole group. Just any additional like activities that are going to help promote them or to get them even further ahead in their reading. They'll even like some MSTEP skills that's coming up here, so we might address some of that stuff too.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to thank Starr, both you and Meagan, for your time and expertise today and sharing the story of all the hard work you are doing. And please thank all the teachers in Chippewa Hills. I know that there's a lot that has gone in, teachers, parapros, everybody, in order for you guys to bring the story forward.
Yeah. They're the true heroes of all this. So absolutely. Yeah. They work so hard. So.
Well, you all should be very, very proud of yourselves and the work you're doing. There's a lot of thank yous going on in the chat right now, and I just really appreciate the time and you took to share today.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. It was an honor to present. So thank you.
Yeah,
thanks, everybody.